Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show, and I have to say this. There is a question of balance in news coverage, and apparently these days, if you work in a TV newsroom, and I spent about 20-plus years of my career in a TV newsroom, as well as doing talk radio, if you ask for balance, if you say, we ought to tell that story, but we really ought to tell both sides, there is a stunning story that came over the 4th of July holiday weekend. It comes out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I know we have some great listeners on WILS, and a bunch of people in a newsroom got fired because they wanted to tell a story in a balanced way. Now, when I was working in a TV newsroom, you always were expected to provide balance. If you talked to somebody on one side of an issue, you had to at least try to call the other side. And if you didn't, you weren't doing your job as a journalist. Well, today, apparently doing your job the way I used to understand it, telling all sides of a story as much as you possibly could, will get you fired. I'll give you the details on that story in just a moment. You're going to want to hear it. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show on the Wednesday after Independence Day. And I hope you all had a wonderful and fun Independence Day. But I hope you remember why we celebrate that holiday. It's not just barbecues. It's not just fireworks. It's about remembering the freedom of this country when it declared its independence, when people signed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to try to win freedom for what is still the freest country on planet Earth, and God bless the United States of America. But let me give you an idea of what's coming up first. I want to invite your phone calls. If you want to join what we call, and we think we live up to this, the best conversation in talk journalism, it happens right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And if you want to vote in our Twitter poll, I'll tell you what the question is in just a moment. That might just get your goat as well. But first, what's coming up the rest of this hour? The White House evacuated over the weekend after some strange white powder was found. And guess what? It's cocaine. Yep, they've done the chemical tests. And you say, now, who in the world would think that they could bring cocaine into the White House? I've got a suspect that I might want to mention. His name is Hunter. We'll get to that. The FBI is already claiming they will unlikely be able to find the culprit in the most secure building on planet Earth. Is there a little bit of cover-up going up to protect Hunter Biden? Because protecting Hunter means protecting Joe Biden as well. We'll get to that later on this hour. In the upscale beach town of Santa Monica, California, they've got a brand new approach for getting the cops on the scene very quickly. The idea has taken flight, and maybe it'll be elsewhere as well. Can you imagine a drone that could show up at the scene of a crime within 30 seconds of the 911 call? And would you feel comfortable as long as some real police officers in a real car are on their way at the same time? The Supreme Court announced unanimous decisions in 3 different cases involving the Pacific Legal Foundation. We're going to talk to them later this hour about how they managed to score those victories. And I want you to take a moment, if you would, doesn't cost anything, might be habit forming, to cast a vote in our Twitter poll. We put up a brand new question each and every day, and you're going to love this one. Should immigrants to the United States be able to prove that they can speak English proficiently in order to become American citizens? I think it's a great idea. The U.S. citizenship test is being updated, and some of the so-called immigrants and advocates say, well, this might just hurt our chances because we want to have less than proficient English, let's say it that way, to be diplomatic about it. The naturalization test is one of the final steps as you try to become a citizen of the United States. Typically, you come to the U.S., you get a green card, that's your legal right to work in the United States, and then if you keep your nose clean for about 5 years and you study hard, you can take the test and become an American citizen. It's a process that takes months to be able to apply. Well, in December of last year, U.S. authorities said the test was due for an update. It hadn't been updated in 15 years. A new version is expected later on this year, according to the Associated Press. And U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is now proposing that the new test add a speaking section to be able to assess your skills at speaking English. An officer would show photos of various kinds of things, daily activities, weather, food, and things like that, and then ask the applicant to verbally describe the photos. In the current test, an officer evaluates speaking ability during the naturalization interview by asking personal questions that the applicant has already answered in the paperwork, and that's how they test it now. They're going to test it just a little bit differently, and I think that's actually a good idea. So should immigrants have to prove that they can speak English proficiently to be able to become an American citizen? I'd answer that one yes. You can answer any way you like, at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. On our website, you don't have to deal with the Twitter nonsense, but whatever. Today's Twitter poll, as always, is brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in, so I join, and I think you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better. Better for you and better for America. I actually got an email the other day from a lady who said, why don't you like AARP? Well, I said, I've never been a member of the group, don't want to be a member of the group. That's a group that's very, very liberal. They support liberal political causes, and among other things, they helped to pass Obamacare, which has been a disaster for America. So if you want to know why I like AMAC, always have, never liked AARP, that's the short reason. Now, in last week's poll, I asked you this: should a man or woman merely accused of domestic violence but not convicted lose the right to own a gun? I said no. So did 88% of you. Only 12% of you said yes. But right now, the ATF is the courts actually are considering whether or not you should be denied the right to keep and bear arms if you are merely accused of domestic violence. But let me get back to Grand Rapids, Michigan. There's a TV station there. I don't know anybody there. It's Wood TV, WOOD TV. And over the holiday, they were covering a Pride Month celebration on 4th of July. And one of the people involved in the newsroom, the news director, had said, we should cover the Pride parades in a balanced way that shows both sides. And a memo was written. I would agree with that memo. Cover it with both sides. The assistant news director that was fired, Amy Fox, according to Gateway Pundit, was ordered to write the memo by the new station director, the news director, Stanton Tang, who was also terminated. Now, here's what it says. We know that West Michigan is a conservative area in many ways. We need to recognize that some stories related to LGBTQ issues are going to be controversial and polarizing. While you personally may not agree with a certain position, while you are personally not agreeing with it, people are entitled to their opinions, and many of them are our viewers. We should not cover every Pride event that we learn about. We need to do some work to discern the newsworthiness of the event. If we're covering Pride events, we need to consider how to make the story balanced and get both sides of the issue. Now, that's a sentiment I would absolutely agree with. Well, there were some other staffers at Wood TV, and they were so triggered, they actually staged a walkout protest, and then they fired the news director. Does anybody think that's the way it should have ended up? Coming up in a moment, Joe Biden's latest climate scheme allows environmental groups to oppose drilling and mining to supply America with what it needs. We'll talk about that. Back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and your emails. You know, the gaslighting from the Biden administration has been absolutely amazing. I don't mean that in a good way. I mean it in a bad way. And that is the president can run around, in the case of Joe Biden, and say, I haven't done anything to restrict drilling for oil or natural gas or all the other things that we need in this country. And a lot of us say, yes, you have right there. And he just tells the public he's not doing it at all. And the latest move by the Biden administration is to put new limits on oil drilling and mining on federal land, except it's running into a bit of a buzzsaw from so-called stakeholders who are saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to do this. We don't want to go that far. Daniel Turner joins me now, who's president of Power of the Future. Daniel, welcome back to the show, and tell my audience, did I characterize that accurately? This is what they're trying to do, is say, we're not doing any of this, and they're doing it at the same time they're telling us they're not. And what is the effect going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an administration who from day one has made the war on fossil fuels central to their agenda. It's part of their green ideology. And then when they dealt with the response, which you could have predicted, I predicted, anyone who understands how the world works predicted, the response being very high energy prices, very high price of all goods and services, very high inflation, all driven from high expensive energy costs. Well, then they want to back off and say, whoa, we're not doing anything wrong, and you can't have it both ways. Quite frankly, I think I'd have a little bit more respect for the Biden administration if they just owned it and said, yeah, look, we know this. We know that prices are going to be high, and this is going to be painful, but that's how committed we are to getting rid of fossil fuels. And instead, they're saying, well, we're not doing anything to hurt fossil fuels, and they blame Vladimir Putin, they blame corporate greed, anything but their own actions.
Well, it's funny, Daniel, that you mentioned that, because you remember during the campaign, there were a few reporters, not very many, who said, Mr. President, the economists are saying if you do this to energy, it might cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. Are you willing to sacrifice all those jobs? And during the campaign, in the 2019 campaign, we played sound bites of Joe Biden said, yep, you're damn right. I'm willing to sacrifice the jobs. There won't be any oil drilling. I mean, he made all these dramatic statements saying what he was going to do. But now that he's doing it, you ask him, are you doing these things? And he says, no. That's just made up by a bunch of conservative nuts.
And that's why voices like yours are so important, because if we had an honest media, they would be hammering on this consistently. And your audience remembers that it wasn't just a couple of years ago where Biden was trying to win over the Bernie Sanders vote. And Bernie is even more radical when it comes to climate issues than Biden was. And it was a very tough primary, and they were neck and neck for a while. And so they wanted Bernie out of the race. So Biden embraced all of Bernie's greenisms, all of his radical left-wing agenda. So if we had an honest media, they would just point this out and say, well, you embraced all of this. Why are you walking away from it now? Oh, you know why? Because it's another election cycle is kicking off, and the American people are dissatisfied. Despite Bidenomics and their great branding effort, there isn't enough cocaine in the White House to assuage the American people of their fears that the economy stinks.
I got to tell you, Daniel, I had some fun with that today, and I'll be having more with it tonight. But one of the
Absolutely.
well, because it's like, I wonder who could have brought cocaine to the White House. Somebody who doesn't have to fear any kind of consequences by being prosecuted for doing it. Who could that be? Some junior level staffer who's making $30,000 a year, barely above minimum wage, for working at the White House and prizes his or her position? Or could it be the president's son? Which one does Occam's razor and least hypothesis say is most likely? Let's get back to the environment, though. This is the part that is going to sound good to some people, but I want to warn people away from it. I live in the Northwest, as you know, and I see these environmental groups, and they go out and somebody will donate a big chunk of land, huge, in some cases, tens of thousands of acres. And they say, we donated to the Nature Conservancy. So the owner gets a giant tax break. And what does the Nature Conservancy say? We're going to protect the land. They lock it up. You can't develop it. You can't do anything with it. This thing that they're proposing at Bureau of Land Management, I was going to say BLM, but that now means something else. They want to allow environmental groups to lease land, they say, for conservation purposes. So in other words, the Sierra Club and all the other tree huggers out there can run around picking the best places where they know there might be oil or natural gas, and then put a long-term lease in place that effectively locks everybody else out of accessing the minerals there?
It's a very wicked agenda that they have planned, and I got to hand it to the left. They are crafty, and this is a brilliant move. It's evil, but it's absolutely brilliant. But yes, if they're saying if you can access some of the 650 million acres of land, roughly 12% of the nation that is controlled by the Bureau of Land Management, if you can lease that land for multiple purposes, right? You can lease it for oil and gas leases, you can lease it for cattle grazing, et cetera. Why can't environmental groups lease it as well? But then they lock it up and they're not allowed to do anything with it. And so it is a very crafty, but it's vile, because we need that land because of the resources that are on it, or in this case, under it. It's what funds our economy. What makes our country operate and function. And so, yeah, I hope this is stopped by the courts. I hope this is stopped by even governors at the local level. And quite frankly, I think we have a really huge opportunity in 2025, God willing, we win the White House, to not just curtail the power of the BLM, but to really give up a lot of its land. There's no reason why some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. controls that much land. And if I were the governor of one of these great states like Nevada or Utah or the Dakotas, where 20, 30, 80, 90% of the land is controlled by some bureaucrat in D.C., if I were the governor of that state, I'd want my land back.
Well, and Daniel, what it makes me, my late mother, who's been gone a long time, but she used to use a phrase called the dog in the manger. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, you have a manger that's designed to hold hay, and the dog goes and lays on top of the hay. And I said, yeah. And she said, that means the cattle and the horses can't eat the hay. The dog has no use for the hay. He's just laying on top of it. They're going to be the dog in the manger. They're going to say, we're going to sit on top of this land. We're not going to let anybody get to it. And the consequence for taxpayers. Now, I want you to back me up on this. If I get this wrong, tell me. But as I understand it, if Daniel Turner and Lars Larson form a little oil drilling company, we don't have one, but if we did, we lease a piece of land from the federal government. We pay a ton of money for the lease. And then the federal government says, by the way, good luck drilling holes. If you happen to find something, the U.S. Treasury gets 15% of everything you find. So you and I go out, we drill a hole, and we find $100 million worth of oil. Or $1 billion worth of oil. 15% of that goes to the U.S. Treasury. If the environmental groups lease the land instead, and they don't drill a single hole at all, then all of that that would have gone to the Treasury doesn't go to the Treasury. Did I get that right?
You got that 100% right. And where do we get all the money, not just for the military and our first responders, but where do we get the money for all of the liberal pet projects that they want government to fund, whether it's student loan forgiveness, whether it's abortion in the third world, right? They think there's an empty pot of money that they want the government to fund all of their liberal ideology. Well, that money has to come from somewhere. And it comes from the private sector being profitable, being productive. So it's just another example of punishing entrepreneurship and punishing people who are willing to make that risk. And that example you gave is spot on. And then when you counter that with the wind and solar world that gets all the government subsidies, that doesn't have to lease the land because the government gives it to it, well, then they have the gall to say wind and solar is cheap or wind and solar are free. But, well, it would be free, too, if someone paid for everything for me, but the oil and gas business doesn't have that luxury.
Well, for the Biden crime and cocaine cartel, the solar panels are great. I mean, where are you buying them? You're buying them from Joe's buddies in Beijing. They'd be happy to sell you all the solar panels you want. They'll sell you all the wind turbines you want, and they'll make them out of electricity generated from good old-fashioned coal in China, which I guess is okay. Daniel, thanks so much. I appreciate your insights for my audience.
Always a pleasure, Lars. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's Daniel Turner from Power of the Future. This is what Joe Biden's trying to do. Lock up land that you and I own in common. It is public land managed by the BLM, and they want to let environmental groups take it and simply lock it up and deny access to the resources. Coming up in a moment, can you imagine if you called 911 and before the cops ever get there in 30 seconds, there's a drone overhead? We'll talk about that coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday. Hope you all had a wonderful Independence Day, and I hope you remember the reason we celebrated. It's not about barbecues or even having beer, even if you're one of those Bud Light drinkers out there. It's all about marking the independence of a country that still offers the greatest liberty to its citizens of any country on planet Earth. And that's a statement I've made 1,000 times before. I've never actually had a naysayer try to challenge me on that. And when they do, I always say, well, tell me the country that offers greater freedoms and greater liberties. And of course, you almost always have to start with and offers them because they are rights you get from God, as John F. Kennedy said, and not from the generosity of the government, because anything the government is capable of giving you, they are capable of taking away from you. I want to tell you about what's going on in Santa Monica, California, and the use of drones in policing, because as you may know, if you listen to the show, I'm a technology guy. I love technology. Doesn't mean I know a lot about it. I just like the way that it works when it works for the benefit of people. Now, artificial intelligence, not so crazy about that. Because it has lots, like every tool in the world, technology that can do one thing can also do other things that you don't want it to do. But let me get to that in a moment. First, welcome to the program. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that at Lars Larson Show. Should immigrants prove that they can speak English proficiently before they become American citizens? I would answer that one yes. And a shout out to our friends in Buffalo, New York, where they listen to great talk radio all day on WHLD. That's AM 1270. And of course, you can find this show as well. And one little mention I want to make, a long overdue boycott, Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's, I've never promoted a boycott. I tell people that I vote with my pocketbook the way many of you do. I don't think I need to sponsor boycotts. You can figure out where to spend your money and where not to spend it. But now, Ben and Jerry's itself is facing a boycott after calling on the United States to, quote, commit to return stolen indigenous land. In their 4th of July message, Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream folks, I don't buy their stuff, and that's by choice, on Independence Day, the American ice cream brand sparked outrage on social media by publishing a Twitter post with an image reading, "The United States was founded on stolen indigenous land. This 4th of July, let's commit to returning it." Now, I think that's ridiculous. In the caption, the company added, "It's high time we recognize that the U.S. exists on stolen indigenous land and commit to returning it. Even if you're not on a diet, that's as good a reason to give up Ben and Jerry's as almost any other, but that is your decision, not mine." And let me tell you one thing about this stolen indigenous land nonsense. When Europeans and others arrived on this continent, what was the system that was in place at the time? There were Native American tribes, as we call them now, indigenous people, if you want to be politically correct or whatever. And what was their system for deciding whether or not somebody owned a piece of land or didn't own a piece of land? There were no titles or deeds or courts or anything like that. So how did you determine whether or not this particular area belonged to your tribe or some other tribe? The rules in place at the time were, if your tribe could take it from the tribe that currently has possession of it, you own it. And as long as you can hold on to it, you continue to own it. And when somebody bigger or better shooter with a bow shows up and takes it away from you, then it belongs to them. That was the system. Now, what did Europeans do? Europeans said, well, if we can take a piece of land and hold on to it, then it belongs to us. That was the system. In other words, the very same system that was used by the indigenous people to determine who owned a piece of land, who had given up a piece of land, and who got the piece of land was the system that the Europeans quickly participated in. Now, if you tell me, well, that's not fair, go back and take a look at the history. Even in the story of the Pilgrims, there was a time when the Pilgrims and another Native American tribe decided they both wanted a piece of land, but it was currently in the possession of a third party, another tribe. So what did the Pilgrims do? They teamed up with the one tribe, and they took the piece of land for their own. That was the way things worked. Now, would you blame Europeans for participating in the system that was already in place when they arrived here and was being used by all of the people, the indigenous people, who currently lived here? I wouldn't fault them for that. In any case, let me grab one call before I tell you about the drones. Let's go to Randy. Hey, Randy, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hey, thanks, Lars. Do I have this correct? You're against Ben and Jerry for calling out supporting indigenous people of this country. Is that correct?
I didn't say supporting. They're suggesting. Their suggestion is not we're in favor of indigenous people. I've got nothing against the tribes. A lot of them have cut some very sweet deals in the treaties that they arrived at. Because if you're trying to set up a straw man saying, I don't support the right of Native American people to call themselves Native American, to have their own sovereign countries, I'm for all of that. What I'm not in favor of is Ben and Jerry's saying the United States exists on stolen land. That's one indictment. And number two, we, the people who currently live here today, should give the land back to who? To the descendants of the people who once had it. I object to that all day long.
Okay, so a good argument. I totally get your side. I don't agree with it. I think the people that we stole this land from, above and beyond any other cultural group, especially one particular cultural group that's getting so much attention across the globe, I totally disagree. The indigenous people of this
Well,
country
what did we steal?
had nothing.
No, hold on. What did we steal?
We took their land.
Oh, no, hold on. When we say their land, how did a tribe at the time Europeans, in the first 10 seconds after Europeans set foot on this land, there were groups of people. They were different groups. They were tribes. They identified themselves as different groups of people. How did they decide whether or not a particular tribe owned a piece of land?
You know what? They figured it out.
No. You're being intellectually dishonest, Randy. They had a way, and the way they figured it out is if my tribe can take the piece of land from your tribe, then we own it. And as long as we can hold on to it and somebody else doesn't take it from us, then it belongs to us. That was their let's figure it out. They did it based on who could take the land and hold it. If you think otherwise, persuade me otherwise, that some other system was in place where they sat down and went to a court or had a judge or a jury decide. Did they decide who owned a piece of land based on who held it and who could hang on to it?
Totally agree with that. They had their own system, but they also had...
And we participated in it. Should we have been locked out of participation because we were newly arrived?
We probably should have, but let me finish.
Oh, hold on, Randy. Then I'm going to ask you this. There were some peoples who arrived on this continent, probably over a land bridge over the Bering Strait or other ways to get here. So when the late arrivals came to what is now North America, and they arrived and said, we want a piece of land, and they rapidly learned the system was, well, if you can take it and hold on to it, it belongs to you. Should the later arrivals have had a lesser claim than the ones who'd been there for a while?
Oh, I think you're stretching it now.
No, why am I stretching it? Can we agree that not all the Native Americans arrived on this piece of territory in the same, say, 100-year period? They arrived here over thousands of years, right?
I would assume so. I wasn't here.
Okay, and when they arrived here, they found out if you want a piece of land, you have to take the piece of land and you have to hold on to it, right?
Okay, so what's the argument then?
Well, my argument is if they had a system, and the system was if you currently hold a piece of land and you can fight off anybody else who tries to take the piece of land, then you own it. When Europeans arrived and participated in that same thing, didn't they legitimately take the land? Come back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday after Independence Day, and one of the great things about this country is our system of justice. Yes, it's imperfect, but I think we got some great decisions just last week from the United States Supreme Court as it wrapped up its current term before it goes back to work in a couple of months, first Monday in October. But in the meantime, some great decisions on race-based admissions in higher education thrown out, the Clean Water Act and the effect on people's ability to use their own land, and free speech. And of course, none of this happens by accident. So I want you to understand, this doesn't just get picked up by the U.S. Supreme Court. Somebody has to bring the case. And in many cases, a lot of the cases, it's been the Pacific Legal Foundation. And Jim Burling is vice president with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Jim, welcome back.
Hey, it's nice to be with you again, Lars.
PLF has to feel pretty good, and its sponsors and donors as well, for backing so many causes and having so many wins. Your batting record is admirable.
I mean, we had a great year this year. We had 3 cases at the Supreme Court. That's 5% of their entire docket this year, and we won every one of our cases this year. And so far, we've won 17 cases at the Supreme Court.
Now you got to keep that up because it's not as though we're running out of cases, because as long as liberals run the land or are loose in the land, you're going to have more of these, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. Every step forward, the liberals try to take a couple steps back. And so they find end runs around the victories that we have. They find new ways to infringe on people's rights. So unfortunately, there is no end of work for us to do.
So tell me this, how do you get ready going forward, and what do you see as the way the court is now operating? For the last couple of years, I've been a bit disappointed in John Roberts, in particular the Chief Justice, because he seemed more concerned with the reputation of the court than he did about simply saying balls and strikes, the way I think he famously answered one of the questions during his confirmation hearing. Are they getting back to just calling balls and strikes and saying, this is what the Constitution says, live with it?
I think Justice Roberts still wants to maintain the reputation of the court above all things. So in this year's term, for example, he voted for the liberals in some voting right cases, a couple of those, which basically dialed back the idea that the state legislatures and the individuals in the states could determine what the boundaries of elections were. It was a victory for racial gerrymandering, if you will.
Yep.
But on the other hand, he ruled against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. So he's trying to give a little to each side. I think he is committed to the institution of the court, whereas some of the other conservatives are much more interested in righting the wrongs that began with the Warren Court era, or perhaps even began with the New Deal era before that.
Also gets a little discouraging for the three liberals on the court because they tend to be on the losing side of all the cases unless they vote with the majority, which they did in one great case just decided on liberty, where they actually voted with the majority and we got a unanimous decision, which doesn't happen all that often.
No, it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes they just really seem to have, really no choice in the matter because it's so clearly that one side or the other is wrong. I mean, they voted for our cases. We had a 9-0 decision in our Sackett wetland case.
Yep.
We had, and so that's clear sometimes that the administration tries to go so far in the wrong direction that they really have no choice but to join us in a case like that.
Well, Jim, I just wanted to tell you congratulations. And when people say to me, who should you turn to if you think you've got one of those cases that really ought to go to the Supreme Court, Pacific Legal Foundation is where you go, and be sure to support them. And I got no other dog in the fight than just admiring PLF from a distance. Thanks so very much, Jim.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
Nice talking to you as well. Let me pick up our first, not our first naysayer, but let's see what Ray has to say. Hey, Ray, how are things in Alabama, and what do you and I disagree about?
Too hot, too wet. But the Ben and Jerry's thing.
Yeah.
You're saying that the settlers did not take the land from the Indians, the tribes, indigenous people, however you want to say it.
Not at all. I didn't say they didn't take it. I said the system is, this is how you decide who owns a piece of land. Who can take it, who can hold it. Was that not the system that they saw when they arrived in North America?
It was.
Okay.
You're right about that.
And was that a legitimate system at the time?
Probably, yes. So by your philosophy there, Russia invading Ukraine is perfectly fine.
No, I didn't say that either.
Wait,
times have changed.
Let me finish my point.
Okay, go ahead.
Finish my point.
Yeah.
They invade Ukraine, that's perfectly legit. If China invades Taiwan, that's perfectly fine. That's the way it's done.
No, I said that's the way it was done in North America.
Why does it change?
Is it still the system? Well, for example, when the Arab nations made war on Israel 3 different times, and during one of those times, the boundary changed, and what was part of the old city of Jerusalem that belonged to the Muslims for quite a period of time, some decades, all of a sudden belonged back to the state of Israel. Would you tell Israel, you got to give that back, including the Western Wall? Would you do that?
Who changed the boundary?
The Arab countries that declared war on Israel, and Israel fought back, and when the war ended, the boundaries had changed. That is the way that most boundaries in most countries have been settled over the millennia, is it not?
Can't really say.
What's that?
I said I really don't know.
Well, come on, Ray. You sound like somebody who reads history. Have many of the boundaries of countries changed as a result of war?
Yes.
Have many of them changed as a result of negotiation?
Of course.
Give me one.
I can't think of it on top of my head.
No, and neither can I. I'm sure there's one or two, but I appreciate the call. Good nays here. Hey, don't you love it when the pharmacy asks, would you like the brand name or the generic version? It's not always, but many times I say generic, please, because, hey, I like saving money too. Wouldn't it be nice if you had that option with CBD? You know, get high quality CBD without the name brand price. Well, now you can. Check out my friends at Generic CBD. At genericCBD.com, they buy direct from the manufacturer, cut out the middleman, and pass the savings on to you. Every product is made in the USA. It's third-party lab tested for quality and strength, contains 0% THC. Try it and you'll love it or get your money back. Tell you what, the stuff's amazing. Remember, genericCBD.com products not sold in stores. So check them out at genericCBD.com. That's GENERIC, genericCBD.com. Your number one source for generic CBD. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. So once in a while, tell Alexa to play The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. And during America's celebration of Independence Day weekend, the Biden crime family put its own unique and twisted view of individual liberty on full display. And I've got a few things to say about that. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you happen to be a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. Today's question, we try to get a new one out of the news of the day every single day, and it's not hard. Should immigrants to America prove that they can speak English proficiently in order to become an American citizen? I would answer yes to that. They're actually considering some updates to the U.S. citizenship test that will actually require a verbal section to the test, and I think that's a good thing. Anyway, you can find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Always brought to you by AMAC, great conservative group. AARP isn't worth your time. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined many years ago. You can too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, about the Biden crime family and its unique and twisted view of individual liberty. The Secret Service found cocaine in the White House library over the holiday weekend, right there in the West Wing of the White House. Now, can I prove that the convicted tax and gun criminal Hunter Biden brought the blow to the White House? Of course I can't. But I know that he was in the White House for the 4th. After all, I've seen the pictures of him and the big guy celebrating the 4th of July. And why not? Individual liberty for Hunter means pleading guilty to serious crimes that actually send average Americans to prison, but not Joe Biden's boy. I mean, as Joe told the mayor of Fort Myers, Florida last October, nobody F's with a Biden. I'd actually quote him entirely, but the FCC would have a problem if I quoted him accurately. Instead of celebrating Independence Day with red, white, and blue, Hunter brings his coke to the most exclusive address on earth without any fear of consequences. Now, could it have been a junior-level staffer who brought cocaine to the White House and then, at the risk of ruining your entire political career? Yeah, could be. Do I think it's most likely Hunter? Absolutely, I think that. And big guy Joe Biden, he knows how that works. Last week's Supreme Court decision on college admissions had Joe Biden blasting his support for racial preferences. Joe's been a bigot since day one. 5 years ago, Joe himself muscled the University of Pennsylvania into accepting his granddaughter despite her poor grades. Joe only opposes special treatment when it doesn't apply to him and the rest of the Biden crime family. To your calls now on this Wednesday. Let's start with Lisa in Kentucky. Hey, Lisa, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Lars. If you'll allow me to get my comments out before your input, I would appreciate it. As far as the Ben and Jerry's issue, I would think that, how the Chinese are buying up our land right now, it's somewhat the same principle. We're just not being scalped, so to speak. And speaking of Asians, I think that we should thank them for the Supreme Court case regarding Harvard and UNC. Obviously, the white guys couldn't get it done. Wait a minute. So, and as far as language, proficient
Yes.
in English, most of us, I'm not, and I'm a fourth
You
generation
sound like you
American.
are.
But I would think that it would be easier to navigate. If I go to Mexico, I need to know some Spanish if I'm going to be able to, navigate that area. If I go to
Agreed.
France, I need to know some French. So, where was I at? Hold on a second. The 4 languages. Thank you. As far as pot, it should be legalized. I know you don't believe that, but you don't have
hold
to buy
on,
it.
Lisa.
As
I
long as
believe
it's
that
not like
pot.
alcohol.
Lisa,
You don't have to buy.
Lisa,
Yes, you
I
didn't
believe
allow me
that
to
pot
finish.
should be. I believe that pot should be legalized the minute a majority of our representatives say so, because they're the ones who represent us. We can vote for somebody to be in the House or the Senate. In Kentucky, you've got Rand Paul, who's a bonus all day long and twice on Sunday, and you got Mitch McConnell, who's not as good. Let's put it. I'll be diplomatic about that. But Lisa, there isn't a majority of the people's representatives in the House that supports legalizing pot. So when you say it should it be legalized before a majority of the people's representatives vote for it?
The people's representatives are not representing the people. So maybe Elon could buy that law.
Except for this, Lisa, I know from experience there are times where members of Congress will say, I'm not voting for that because if I do, my constituents will throw me out of office. It's a very simple equation, and most of the House members, they have to run for re-election basically continuously because every time they get done with one election cycle, there's another one that shapes up about 12 months later that they have to be in. So the ones who got re-elected last November are going to have to get re-elected this November. They vote for the things that they think are popular with their voters, and they vote against the things that are unpopular. Is that a bad system?
Well, if I think that the system isn't representing me, then obviously the system is.
Oh, but hold on, Lisa, you're one of those. See, there are lots of things Congress does that aren't the way I would do it. And I say, but I'm one voter out of 800,000 in a congressional district.
Pardon me. What does one of those mean? What does that mean?
Well, somebody who says if they didn't vote the way I wanted it to go, then they're wrong. Well, the thing is, when you're a member of Congress, you represent about 800,000 citizens. Do you think that everybody in your congressional district agrees with you?
Of course not. Of course not.
There you go.
Okay. So, and I'm almost done. You interrupted me before I finished my comment.
Well, you know what? We don't do that, Lisa. We have a conversation on this show. We don't do it that way, and I don't let listeners dictate how long they get to go, but I do appreciate your call. Let's go to Cody in California. Cody, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Afternoon, Lars. Hey, I was just calling in regards to the Ben and Jerry's thing I heard you talking about. This country just celebrated its 247th birthday yesterday, and this country was created on mistakes. And not all of those were right, not all of those were wrong. But at what point are we going to just let the past be the past instead of trying to change it in the future? This all
right
falls
now.
back to
as
the
far as I'm concerned, Cody, we can start right now. I mean,
yeah,
because
but
otherwise
you
you could
take from me to give somebody else their land.
I agree.
To get their land back from the answer. This falls back to the reparations thing. And
I agree.
It's absolutely asinine that we were created on this. Yes, was it wrong? Yes, but we're going forward.
Well,
and we're trying to teach kids in schools, some schools, not all schools. Do we teach them is it right or is it wrong?
Cody,
and
the only thing I try to persuade you with is the reason I make that argument. What was the system that was in place when you got there, right? Just like if you went to work at a new job and you got there and you said, how do I move up? And they say, if you're a sales job, you say, you sell more of our stuff than anybody else here, you will rise to the top. You say, okay, that's the system. So you start selling better than everybody else in that place, and you're the newest guy in that place, and you end up with the top job in a year or two. And everybody says, well, that ain't right. I say, well, the system was, if you sell the most stuff, Cody gets the top job. If he doesn't, he ends up at the bottom of the pile. When Europeans arrived in North America, the system was, if you can take the land and hold on to it, it belongs to you. The minute somebody can take it away from you, it doesn't belong to you. It was the system in place. The Native Americans endorsed it, and we participated. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday. We've just had Independence Day, and it's great to be with you. If you want to join the conversation, it's easy to do. 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And we've talked a lot about the fact that kids are now telling parents, telling teachers, telling counselors, and even doctors, I was born a boy, I want to be a girl, or vice versa. And now the question is, who actually controls that? And if you're old-fashioned like me, you say, well, parents get a chance to control that, and nobody under the age of 18 is considered an adult or mature enough to be able to make those kind of decisions. So, should the doctors be prohibited from giving so-called transgender affirming care, medical procedures, both chemicals and surgery, to minors? I thought we'd talk about that with Ilan Serlovich, who's the CEO and designer and founder for eGuard Watch Company. It's good to have you back, sir.
Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
So let's start with this and make it very simple to begin with. Should any minor be able to go to any person other than mom and dad and decide to take a course of either chemicals or surgery or both to change their gender without mom and dad being involved in that decision?
I feel, even to be totally honest, and maybe I'm an extremist for believing this, I don't believe any child should be put on hormone blockers for gender dysphoria or have mutilation surgery where they're having parts of their body removed, any more than if a child identified as not having two arms, that I would say it's completely unethical to remove their arms. You know, like you're not an adult.
I agree with you.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said I agree with you. I don't think that's radical at all. And by the way, folks, what Elon mentioned, the idea that I don't feel comfortable with arms and legs. There are actually people who suffer from a psychological disorder where they want their arms and legs removed, and they come up with all kinds of inventive ways to get doctors to do it. I think it's mutilation. And I go with the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. I don't see how medicine has found its way to this place.
And it's interesting because we're starting to see a lot of doctors speak out against it, saying we don't know the long-term effects. We're starting to see a lot of kids, because this is a new kind of social phenomenon, at least to this degree. And so now we're starting to see the consequences of it, and we'll see them far more in 10 years. We don't know. We're experimenting on children. And people are trying to justify it by saying it's unethical not to let these children be experimented on.
Yeah, and they use the argument that if you don't mutilate the child with either chemicals or surgery or a combination of the both, that they may end up being more susceptible to suicide. And yet I'm already seeing studies out of Western Europe that say, no, a lot of post-surgical transgender people are ending up being just as suicidal, if not more so, than those people who haven't had the procedures. And that's disturbing, too. It suggests, call me crazy, but it sounds like a mental condition, not a physical condition.
Yeah, and the scariest thing is that modern-day doctors, many of them, are coming from this not out of place of analyzing data, but out of an ideological standpoint that if you don't support a trans child to do whatever they want to their body, that you are an extremist transphobe and that you're the enemy of the movement. And so they don't care about the data. You have actual doctors nowadays who come at things from an ideological standpoint, not a data standpoint. That's extremely scary.
Talking to Elon Serlovich, who's CEO, designer, and founder of the eGuard Watch Company. I just love your insights in some of these, and we probably will find someplace you and I don't agree on things. I'm sure we will. But in this case, we've got to throw money into the equation because, as you said, there are some doctors who come to this because they're ideologically bent in that direction. But there's a lot of money there, too. The current estimate is something like $1.9 billion in the United States is the estimate for this year, and that'll grow to $5 billion in a fairly short period of time. When there's that much money involved, it seems people will do things, they'll say they're doing them out of ideology, but listen, you can't ignore the big dollar signs either, can you?
Yeah, I'm in full agreement there, too. And that's kind of a consistent problem in medicine in general. You look at certain pharmaceutical companies, you look at everything throughout COVID. There were certain things that take place in the medical industry that are clearly money-driven, not health-driven. And, you're seeing it in full effect with the trans movement. And it's on children. Again, I don't care if you're an adult and you want to go do something to your body. I'm all for it. You have the right to do whatever you want to your body. But a child who is not capable of making those long-term decisions, their logical center in their brain is not developed. It's why they don't go to prison when they commit crimes in the same way as an adult. We literally understand that they cannot comprehend the crime they're committing to the same extent as a fully grown adult. But we're going to say, hey, you can go remove part of your body, which will have, and go on hormone blockers, which will have not only physical effects, but psychological effects. You're messing with your total hormonal balance at the most important time of your life, which is puberty.
Well, the other thing that's troubled me, Elon, is there's at least some suggestion that a gigantic percentage of what is transgender is 6/10 or 0.06, it's 6/10, not 6/100 of 1% of the whole population. You say, okay, that's a small number. Well, then why are 30 or 40% of them autistic or show signs of autism spectrum? And you say, is this the medical community essentially taking advantage of people who, as autistic people, don't feel very welcomed in society in many cases, and all of a sudden they announce they're transgender and they're welcomed in every quarter of the liberal side of the aisle? And you say, well, would that be tempting to somebody who's had autism and maybe doesn't feel well embraced by the rest of society? But the minute they say, no, I think I'm transgender, everybody on one side of the aisle says, hey, you're to be applauded and congratulated for your courage and that kind of thing.
Yeah, again, that's by design. That's a movement to rid you of any connection to anything other than some form of state control that you could believe in fully. It'll become your religion. And we've seen this new religion of transgenderism, of religion of the state, where they can tell you what's right and wrong and you'll fully believe in it. And that's where you derive all value in life, because you have no personal identity anymore. And they're doing that to a lot of kids. You're starting to see the numbers of kids who identify as LGBTQIA plus 45 ampersand going up so high that it makes no sense. There is no way to rationally explain it other than some degree of social engineering to push these children to gain value in society by identifying as such. So that's a whole other aspect of the problem, that a lot of these kids are not truly suffering from gender dysphoria. They're suffering from an identity issue, which is they don't feel important. They don't feel special. And so we're telling them the way to feel special is to be transgender and mutilate your body at 12 years old. That's the new movement. With
lifetime consequences. And at the same time, Elon, I remember in the couple of years right before this thing really took off like a rocket, there were people saying, kids' brains really haven't matured till they're 26. And I was hearing them almost suggest, even at 21 or 22, you shouldn't be held fully responsible for the things you do. And you say, well, I don't necessarily endorse that. I don't like that idea at all, because it seems like an excuse to be able to go out and do some violent and antisocial things and say, well, my brain wasn't developed. I'm only 24. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be signing contracts or making any other decisions for yourself. Elon, company's doing well?
Yeah, definitely got a lot of support for the last ad where we stood up for biological women, had a positive response to that. So very thankful to everyone out there who actually stands by, companies that believe in what they believe.
Well, keep it up, because we're proud of you. Elon, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Glad to have you on the program. Glad to get to your calls in the next segment. By the way, dog parents, do you remember that very first time you met your dog? Like Sir Winston Churchill. He's coming up, my dog, my Bernese Mountain Dog. He's coming up on 3 years old on August 5th. I'll tell you what, my dog's wonderful. It's safe to say I'd do anything for Sir Winston Churchill. And I know you feel the same way about your dog. And the key to your dog's healthy lifespan starts with great food. And that's why I love Dr. Marty Pet's Nature's Blend. It's a premium dog food made with simple ingredients: turkey, beef, salmon, and duck. And unlike most kibble that's baked with high heat, that destroys a lot of nutrients, Nature's Blend is freeze-dried raw. It has zero artificial preservatives, additives, or fillers. And the best part is it's naturally full of protein and fiber and omega-3s, doesn't have any junk food in it. Dogs love it. Sir Winston certainly does. Here's the way you get it. Claim 54% off Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text pets to 511-511. That's pets to 511-511. Message and data rates apply. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Our Twitter poll today, and we write a fresh question, my producers and I, out of the news of the day. Try to keep it as current as possible. Should immigrants to America, I'm not talking about illegal aliens, I'm talking about people who come legitimately, the ones who get the green card, they go through the process, They say, I have a right to come to America, to live there, to work there. And in 5 years, if you keep your nose clean, you stay out of trouble, and you study hard, then you can become a citizen. But now they want to update the U.S. citizenship test. And usually these updates are not the kind of thing that I would support. But in this case, this is great because they want to test proficiency in speaking English. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you can call me ethnocentric or egocentric or whatever. I think English is the language of success, especially if you live in the United States, but even if you live in other parts of the world. If you don't speak English, there are so many things that are locked away from where you can get to them. There are jobs you will not get in America if you can't speak English and do it well. So should immigrants prove they can speak English proficiently to become an American citizen? I'd answer that one yes. You can answer any way you like at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group, and you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Let's go to your calls now. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. And naysayers always go first. To Martin in Nevada. Hey, Martin, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Hey, Lars. I just think a better way, rather than a simple test like that, is to make English the language of government in this country. If you study Pax Romana, like the whole idea that we all come from everywhere and encased in our language are our mores and our values.
Yeah.
I think this way, too, we force liberals out in the open, because I'm sure there will always be a market to learn English. There will always be people that will need to know the language. In this way, they can fund it and pay for it.
And what? Martin, you dropped out.
Getting it inside of the things like you suggest,
well,
and that eventually
look,
I know I'm going to end up paying for it.
I think, Martin, it's a little bit of chicken and egg. In other words, if tomorrow we made English the official language of government, right? And so every building permit, every job application, all those things had to be done in English.
Every court case.
Every court case, yes. But the problem is that gives the liberals an excuse to say, you see, because not all these people speak or read or write English, we have to provide translation services. If instead you went at it the other way.
Do. That's
well, I know, but we need to have less of that. If you say we're going to
privatize that whole industry, and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. Build it, and they will come.
Well, but when you say privatize it, you mean that
rather than me.
But you mean that private individuals would pay for it, because from the liberal point of view, if you said to everybody who doesn't,
there will always be a demand. If they can afford to pay a coyote, they can afford to learn English.
Okay. And good idea. Thank you very much, Martin. I appreciate the call. Let's go to Chuck in South Carolina. Hey, Chuck, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
I wanted to speak to the Native American issue, and that if saying we did take it from them, and I guess we did, there's no way we could give it back, because every square foot of the country was claimed by some Indian tribe. So if we gave it back, we'd all have to go find somewhere else to live. So I think it's about time for them to get over it.
Well, I think you're right. And then there's the second question, Chuck. Who do you give it back to? Because do you say, do we give it back in proportion to what the tribes currently hold in their sovereign nations that were established as treaties with the U.S. government? Say that tribe has 5 million acres and this tribe only has 1 million. So we give we give a greater proportion of it to this group than to that group. None of that stuff makes any sense, does it?
No, it sure doesn't. And it's just time to move on. They've already been given millions of acres of land.
I know. I'm well aware of that. And believe me,
some of the best hunting and fishing land in the whole country, they own it.
They do. Here's what I'd like to suggest. The way this all got started was Ben and Jerry's, the big ice cream company owned by a couple of liberal guys, who turned out to be too liberal for their own good, if you remember the stories we've told on the show in years gone by, they need to say, we are Ben and Jerry's, and we're going to give our entire net worth and the worth of the company to the tribes to set it right. What they're suggesting is not that they give anything away. They want everybody else to give away. And I agreed with the caller who said this is just preparation so the tribes can take part in reparations along with descendants of slaves and the like. So, I think Ben and Jerry's, if they really want to put their money where their mouth is, then what they ought to do is say, we're going to give away the entire net worth of our company to the Native American tribes, because after all, if Ben and Jerry's was built on stolen land, then Ben and Jerry's should be given back to the Native Americans. Show us by example what you want us to do. But I don't think they want to do that. I think Ben and Jerry's and all their various stockholders probably like the money they've made selling ice cream, and they want to hang on to it. But they want everybody else to give back. And they'll give a token amount, but that's about it. So I don't buy their argument. By the way, I do want to mention this. There was a great piece in American Conservative pointed out to me by one of my great producers, Mackenzie. And I looked at this, and this is fascinating because now we're seeing that Joe Biden wants to extend holding the information back about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, what was supposed to happen, there was a deadline of October the 26th, 2017. So 6 years ago, and more than half a century after the assassination in Dealey Plaza, they're still holding the documents back, and it makes no sense. He issued a memo on certifications regarding disclosure of information in certain records related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. There's a law in place that's still on the books that said the deadline 6 years ago to let all this information go. By executive fiat, points out American Conservative, Biden made his memo the final certification under the act, meaning that at least so far as the commander-in-chief is concerned, the legislation passed unanimously by Congress more than 30 years ago is now dead. Biden's edict looks like an effort to preempt a conclusion to legal activity that's underway right now. In other words, the information would get out. The nonprofit Mary Farrell Foundation filed suit in federal court against Biden and the National Archives, charging that the president had already violated the JFK Records Act when he certified postponement of the files to October of 2021. And then in December of last year, he proclaimed that he was again certifying postponement, the fourth time a president has done so since the legal deadline. His 2023 memo is trying to put a final stamp on that process. Something's going on there, and someone political is being protected by this, and it should stop. It needs to stop right now. The defendant's lawyers argue the courts have no authority to enjoin or constrain the president in the exercise of his executive powers. The JFK Records Act is a statute that's on the book. That means it was designed to correct an error in the implementation of another law. In other words, as they write, the court should interpret the law as broadly as possible to fulfill Congress's objectives, and a run-of-the-mill executive privilege claim is not good enough. Biden is claiming he's above the law. He wants to hold back the information from going to the public. But what exactly is going on there? I wish I could tell you. I don't know. But at this point, I suspect Joe Biden is trying to protect some of his friends, as he usually does. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly. I got a question for you, though. Should the controversial book known as Gender Queer be included in the National Education Association's recommended reading list for public school libraries? And if you wonder, why am I suggesting the NEA should have anything to say about it? Well, it does make sense at some level to say that the largest teachers union in America that represents all those teachers could be involved in suggested reading. And yet in this case, there seems to be more of a political agenda that's involved in that. Sean Carney is CEO and president of 40 Days for Life. Sean, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
What is the NEA trying to do here?
Child abuse. I mean, from everything you just said, unfortunately, it's true. It's just getting to the point where none of this stuff is really complicated. I mean, we can get mad and throw our hands up in the air, but they're going after the children unapologetically. A lot of industries have gone after children. Tobacco did it. Alcohol has done it. Many industries have gone after kids, and they've been punished for it. This is just so blatant and perverted and bizarre and stupid. The teachers have just lost their minds, and I think a lot of that was revealed during COVID when they basically said we don't want to work at all, ever.
As long as we get paychecks.
As long as we get a paycheck. And, really that benefited good schools. I mean, the good schools that were committed to education, I know Texas were probably about 2 or 3 years away from school vouchers from what they're saying, actual school vouchers where you can pick your school. But the good schools really benefited towards that. And the same will be the case for this. I mean, people they'll start to just give up any remaining hope on public education, and they'll say, we're doing something else. I mean, we've got to create charter schools or private schools or homeschool or whatever you're going to do, but this can't be an option. You can't morally expose your kids to this.
I mean, because just to make it clear to everybody, this book called Gender Queer gets lots of criticism because it depicts and has descriptions of oral sex and masturbation. And you say, well, why? What possible reason could a legitimate teacher have for saying this should be presented to children? And, I guess I'm left to the conclusion that some of these teachers do want to indoctrinate kids. And some of them want to have kids exposed to sexual behavior at an age where I think virtually everybody agrees they're not nearly mature enough. They face a great risk of harm. And let their parents take care of it. And here's the NEA saying, no, let the teachers union, not even the government, but the teachers union control the process. And I would expect most parents, as you said, to reject the idea and say, I'm taking my kids somewhere else. I'll spend the extra money. I'll take the extra time to homeschool. I'm not letting my kids be subject to this. I'm worried, though, Sean, that there are plenty of parents out there who either lack of resources or plain old laziness, say it's just easier to send them to the government school and let the government school do what they will.
Yeah, and I think, the laziness, that's on them, but I think the lack of resources, people who can't afford a good Christian school or a good Catholic school, I think that's a problem, and I think school vouchers are a good answer to that. I mean, we should be giving these parents the resources from their own tax funding, in most cases, of paying for these horrible public schools, giving them that money, and allowing them to go and find a Christian or Catholic school that's solid and not teaching their kids garbage. I mean, part of the problem is the left has just gotten on this theme, and I think it's relatively new. Maybe I'm just being very naive. I'm a old millennial, but they're on this theme which is anti-innocence and anti-purity.
Yep.
And the LA Dodgers are leading the charge. I mean, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, I've seen them for years. They go to the West Coast Walk for Life in San Francisco every year. I've seen them out there. They cuss at kids and yell absurd things at kids. And they're a bunch of nuts, and everybody knows it. And the gays in California think they're all nuts, and they want nothing to do with them. And then all of a sudden now they're mainstream, and they're being honored by a Major League Baseball team. That's the difference between 10 years ago and today. And this acceptable hatred of innocence or purity that we must make everyone around us a pervert as soon as possible is a very strange new phenomenon that the left is advocating. And of course, they're trying to do it as if they're, civil. But that's just, to me, that's a new thing just the last really year, 2 years.
See, I'm with you, especially on the school voucher piece. In fact, just today, we found out in the last few hours that Shapiro, the governor in Pennsylvania, they apparently held him up for ransom and said, okay, you're going to sign school choice because you promised to do it as a candidate. And literally the legislature said, we won't pass a budget for the entire state of PA if you fund the school vouchers. So he's apparently agreed in the last couple of hours to say, okay, I'll kill the thing. And you say, why would you do that? Because I'm with you, Sean. Every time we talk school vouchers, I've been in favor for a long time, school choice. parents will say, or people say, well, what if they spend the money on the wrong thing or whatever? And I say, listen, think about every government program you have that assists people. And I could argue whether it's philosophically a good idea or not to have food stamps or Section 8 or 100 other things, right? But every single one of them, Pell Grant, spend it at almost any college you want. Food stamps, any grocery store you want. Medicare, Medicaid, any doctor that takes Medicare or Medicaid, any hospital, you can spend it there. Well, what about my school dollars? Nope, you can only spend those at a government institution. I said, does that make any sense to anybody? That this one kind of thing that is so universal those dollars may only be spent at a government institution called a K-12 public school. And if you move into a neighborhood anywhere in America, you'll be told you don't have any choice. If you live at this address, your kids go to school at go to class at that school. And no choice, no nothing. And it makes no sense, even when you compare it to the design of other programs that assist people in one way or another.
It's a really great point. I mean, I've never thought of it that way. It is the only time we do this. It's the only time we say, hey, because you live here, you have to use this school. Yeah, but the school sucks. It doesn't matter. You have to do it, or else you're on your own. And even if you opt out, this is weird to me. If you opt out, you still have to pay taxes. So if you send your kid to a Catholic school, you still have to pay for the public school education, which you don't use in the name of the common good. And there's a good argument for that. I understand it.
I do too. Sean Carney is the CEO and president of 40 Days for Life. Sean, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and occasionally tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday following Independence Day, and I'm glad to take your calls as well. Should we block the rays of the sun from hitting the earth as Joe Biden is proposing? I never knew that Joe Biden was an astrophysicist or any kind of physicist, although I'm sure he could probably fake it pretty well. He faked his way through college. He faked his way through the U.S. Senate. He faked his way through the vice presidency, and he became a multi-millionaire while he was doing it. So, hey, why not? Have him take on space science as well. I'll get into the details of this crazy idea that apparently the White House is entertaining. But first, welcome to the best conversation in talk journalism. It happens right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you happen to be a naysayer, we love naysayers on this program. We'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. I'll get to our Twitter poll here in just a moment. And a big shout out to our friends in Emporia, Virginia, where they listen to great talk radio all day long on WEVA. That's AM 860 in Emporia, Virginia. And you can hear this show as well every day, Monday through Friday. Anyway, let me tell you what's coming up this hour, and then I'll get back to Joe Biden's plan to block the sun, to cool off the overheated planet Earth, if you're going to believe he's that crazy. Vice President Kamala Harris is breaking new records. She has now set an all-time record for vice presidents when it comes to low approval ratings. Is the Biden-Harris regime's future looking a little bit on the bleak side? The president wants to sell what he calls Bidenomics to voters to try to win another term in office. What is it, and why shouldn't you buy into it? We'll get into that as well. And if a school resource officer can be acquitted for not even doing the bare minimum to fulfill the basic mandate of their job, which is to protect school children, what's the point of having such police officers? Now, I've always supported the idea of school resource officers. I think they're a tremendous benefit. The kids get a chance to know a cop, either a sheriff's deputy or a police officer, and the police officer is there if somebody comes to the school intending to do harm. An awful lot of districts have decided to do away with school resource officers. I think that's a foolish point of view. But when you think back to what happened in Parkland, Florida, about 6 years ago, 17 people died, including children. And there was a school resource officer on hand. And he did exactly nothing. And as we told you last week, a jury in Florida acquitted him. And now he gets a chance to collect his $110,000 a year pension. and sit there in retirement having failed the kids altogether in the one time that he had one job: protect the kids. We'll talk to the father of one of those students who lost her life on that day at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland, Florida. Oh, and take just a moment to cast a vote in my Twitter poll. You'll find the question, brand new one every day. We write it out of the news the day. Should immigrants prove that they can speak English proficiently in order to become an American citizen? Well, you know it or not, America is one of the most generous countries on planet Earth when it comes to immigration. Now, I'm not talking about Joe Biden's hordes of illegal aliens who just flood across the border. I'm talking about the people who actually do it the legal way. They apply to get an American green card. It usually takes years. They get into the United States, and if they stay here 5 years, and if they work hard, if they pay their own bills, if they stay out of legal trouble, after 5 years, they can study and take a test and become an American citizen. In other words, they get something that is literally priceless. I've asked people before on this show when they call up to say, oh, we should just let anybody in. I say, if you could sell your American citizenship tomorrow and you could name the sum, how much money would you want if you had to leave the United States, but you could go anywhere else on planet Earth you chose to go? Now, I would never do this, but I've asked people, how much would you value your American citizenship at? I mean, most people know the value or at least the price of many things. If somebody said, would you sell your house for $1 million? There are plenty of people who say, yeah, write me the check. I'll be moved out of here in 15 minutes. If they said, would you sell your car for the right price? Things are for sale. Would you ever consider giving up your American citizenship, even if somebody could write you a multi-million-dollar check? Usually when I present people with that kind of situation, they say, there's no way in the world I would never give up my American citizenship, not for any amount of money. I count myself in that group of people. I would never give it up for any amount of money. And that's even assuming somebody could write you a check big enough, you could go somewhere else, England, Switzerland, South America, Africa, wherever you want to go, and have millions of dollars in the bank. Most Americans, real Americans, would say, I would never give it up. So if somebody wants to become an American citizen, should they be tested on whether or not they can speak the English language with proficiency? And if they can't, can they really take advantage of all the great things that this country has to offer? Being involved in the political system, working a job, raising a family, being part of a community. If you can't speak the predominant language of this country, how are you going to make that happen? Anyway, you can find the question at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group a long time ago, and you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, I also got a lot of attention because we mentioned that Ben & Jerry's, you know, the big ice cream company, well, they're not that big, but they sell some very expensive ice cream. They put out a tweet on the 4th of July in which they said the United States was founded on stolen indigenous land. This is the 4th of July. Let's commit to returning the land. And then in the caption to that, they said it's high time we recognize the U.S. exists on stolen indigenous land and commit to returning it. I couldn't disagree with them more. It is such a cockamamie point of view, but that's Ben & Jerry's for you. I don't agree with it at all, and an awful lot of people, understandably, are suggesting that maybe Ben & Jerry should turn over their net worth to the indigenous people of the United States. If the country was stolen, then so was Ben & Jerry's as well. Thanks for listening, by the way, in Buffalo, New York on WHLD. That's AM 1270. You can find my show there Monday through Friday. But let me tell you about this plan to block the sun. I know, crazy stuff comes out of the Biden administration all the time. Consider this. The Daily Mail reports that the White House has opened the door to an audacious plan to block sunlight from hitting the surface of the earth in a bid to halt global warming. That's how climate crazy they've become. Despite some scientists warning the effort could have untold side effects from altering the chemical makeup of the atmosphere, President Joe Biden's administration admits they are open to the idea It has never actually been attempted before. There's no proof it would work, and who knows what the side effects would be. In a report released last Friday by the White House, officials suggested limiting sunlight to rapidly cool down the planet. Glad to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to take your calls. Coming up in a moment, Kamala Harris has now achieved the historic accomplishment of becoming the lowest-rated vice president in American history. What does that say about the future of the Democrats and Biden and Harris? We'll get to that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And consider this. How crazy is the Biden-Harris administration right now? Joe Biden has amazingly low approval ratings among Americans. Most Americans think we're on the wrong track. But he's more popular even than Kamala Harris is. According to the latest poll, Vice President Kamala Harris, who's broken all kinds of other records, she raised her right hand in 2021 and was sworn into office. She became the first female vice president in American history. But she also became the first South Asian and the first black vice president. Except that all of that virtue signaling and all that politically correct DEI nonsense doesn't seem to have done her much good. So guess what happened? NBC News, which is one of the alphabet networks, they tend to try to shelter the liberals from their own bad news. They had a brand new poll out that is an absolute record. Harris has received the net negative rating of -17. Now, what that means is you do a poll and you say, do you approve of Vice President Harris, or do you disapprove? Her disapproval numbers are so high that they wipe out all of the positive and they take it to -17. That is the lowest rating for any vice president in American history. Mike Pence, who was not tremendously popular, especially on the left side of the aisle, because he was a God-fearing person, it didn't take all the politically correct positions that the left would have him have. He only went to -4. Kamala Harris goes to -17. Now, when did NBC decide to release this poll? And this will tell you something about the mainstream media. Ordinarily, when I've worked at TV and radio stations, occasionally you do polling. It tends to be very expensive, and you tend to want to make a lot out of it. So if you get a poll and it produces some really extraordinary results, you don't want to bury that on the back page if you're a newspaper. You don't want to bury that at the back of the newscast or Saturday night at 10 o'clock at night. You want to tell everybody, we got this extraordinary poll. So when did NBC News choose to release this poll showing that Kamala Harris was the lowest rated vice president in all of American vice presidential polling history? They released it on the Monday between the holiday weekend of Independence Day and 4th of July itself. In other words, NBC released the poll when it was least likely to be seen by almost anybody in the country. They dumped it out. They did the equivalent of what government bureaucracies do when they do the Friday night document dump, when they take a bunch of information they don't want anybody to really pay attention to, and they release it at 5 o'clock on Friday night heading into a holiday weekend. The only place that's better is in the middle of the holiday weekend, when most people, during a Independence Day holiday weekend, a 4-day weekend, an awful lot of people have turned off the news altogether. I understand that. I've worked in the news business a long time. You know that people tend not to pay much attention to the news over a holiday weekend, especially if the holiday falls, as Independence Day did this year, on a Tuesday, and most people have Monday off. So it's right smack dab in the middle of that giant holiday, and they say, let's flush that information out now. Nobody can accuse us of not releasing the information, but we released it when the smallest number of people were likely to see it. And as news, this is from, who is this? Gateway Pundit, I believe. As news of her low record rating spread, several political influencers and consultants tweeted out a sarcastic response. Best insurance policy Joe Biden has ever had. That was the response from GOP consultant Giancarlo Sopo. In GOP consultant Matt Wolking's sarcastic tweet, "We did it, Joe. referencing Harris's response to winning the election that was caught on film. Although there's no consensus as to why she received such a low rating, some experts have attributed it to the Biden administration's biggest policy failures, as well as her own poor PR image. I want to remind you, all the way back to when Joe Biden announced that he was going to deliberately choose a vice president who was female and a person of color. And we said at the time, that's an affirmative action choice to a T. In other words, you're not choosing somebody because they're very good at something. You're not choosing somebody because, and this has been the case in a lot of presidential election races, where somebody who's from the northeastern United States, Massachusetts, for example, like John F. Kennedy, chooses somebody from the South, like a Lyndon Johnson, as his vice president. Why? Because geography, which probably makes less difference today, but geography is a big deal. You've got somebody from the upper Northeast, you need somebody from the South. You've got somebody from the West Coast, you pick somebody from the East Coast. In other words, you try to balance out the ticket. In Harris's case, they chose her based on her race and her gender. They didn't choose her based on her ability. So what happened? The minute that Joe Biden started putting her to work at something, I mean, he couldn't exactly say, have tea with the ladies, Kamala. He placed Harris as his point person in charge of the southern border and passing H.R. 1, the Democrats' election takeover bill. And of course, the southern border has turned into an invasion and a disaster for the entire United States. And Kamala Harris is the point person on that. And of course, the election takeover bill, that didn't go anywhere at all, which means she has exactly no accomplishments as vice president. And then Matt Carpenter, director of Family Resource Center Action, told the Washington Stand, as unpopular as Biden is, his administration has seen movement on its legislative agenda. Not much, but they've seen a little bit. Too bad for Harris. None of that success has been attributed to any of her efforts. The second reason he suspects is due to Harris's bizarre speeches, complete with circular reasoning and poorly timed laughter, often described as cackling. Now, I'd plead guilty to having described Kamala Harris's speech that way. She'll show up in front of a crowd, and we've even gotten tired of running the sound bites of her doing it. She'll show up in front of a crowd. She clearly has no idea what she's talking about. So she's like some poor kid, me, in sixth grade, told to stand up in front of the class and give a 5-minute speech. And you stand up there, and about 50 words into that, or about 4.5 minutes in, you've already run out of material. So you just start talking in circles. That is what Kamala Harris does almost every time she's in front of a microphone. And then somebody will ask her a serious question, and she responds by laughing. Or they'll ask her some other kind of question, and almost every time, Kamala Harris has exactly the wrong response. Now, why does she do that? I don't know. All I know is this. When she was running as a presidential candidate, she ended up dropping out of the race for president, not because she was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. That came later. She dropped out before a single primary election vote had been held in a single state. And why? Because she barely moved the needle when it came to political popularity. She had 1 or 2% of the people, 3 or 4%. It was tiny. It was nothing. It made Jeb Bush look like a roaring success by comparison, unfortunately. Glad to be with you. By the way, don't you love it when the pharmacy asks you, do you want the name brand or the generic version? It's not always, but many times I say generic, please, because, hey, I like saving money too. Wouldn't it be nice if you had that option with CBD? You know, get high quality CBD without the name brand price. Well, now you can. Check out my friends at Generic CBD. At GenericCBD.com, they buy direct from the manufacturer. They cut out the middleman. They pass the savings on to you. Every product is made in the USA. It's third-party lab tested for quality and strength. It contains 0% THC, so you know it's clean there. Try it for 30 days. You'll love it or you get your money back. I'll tell you what, the stuff is amazing. Remember, GenericCBD.com products are not sold in stores, so check them out at GenericCBD.com. That's GENERIC, GenericCBD.com. That's GenericCBD.com, your number one source for generic CBD. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Coming up, We'll talk about that terrible shooting in Parkland, Florida, half a dozen years ago. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I mentioned to you last week that there was a terrible decision, I think, by a jury. And ordinarily, I have great respect for the jury system in America. I think it's better than every other judicial system on planet Earth. And believe me, not every country has a jury system where we trust 12 average folks from the community to make literally life and death decisions about whether or not somebody is held to account for the crimes they may have committed. But we do it here, and I think it works well. Unfortunately, last Thursday, a Florida jury cleared the security officer, the sheriff's deputy member by the name of Scott Peterson, who was a part of the Broward County Sheriff's Department. They became known as Broward's Cowards because this deputy in particular was the school resource officer at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018 when 17 people were murdered, including quite a number of children. And he was accused of negligence. He was accused of criminal neglect and a count of perjury. And for whatever reason, the jury said, nope, he's not guilty of anything. I thought we'd talk about that with Andy Pollack, who is a school safety activist. His 18-year-old daughter, Meadow Pollack, was murdered in that shooting where Scott Peterson stood outside with his gun in his hand and did nothing as children were being murdered inside. Andy is also the author of Why Meadow Died, which is a great read about a sad subject, but a great read all the same. Andy, welcome back.
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me on. And it definitely was a terrible decision on the jury. I was looking to set a precedent for all law enforcement agents that work in schools or whenever they respond that they know they have to go forward and go into that building. And I was let down, and I was very disappointed on that jury's decision.
Did you get any insights as to why the jury decided that this man whose assigned job was to be the school resource officer was not held to be negligent when he failed to do his job that day? Any insight as to why that happened?
It had to do with laws about being a caretaker over the children. With the laws in Florida and throughout the country, they couldn't prove caretaker, so the neglecting wasn't able to stick. But there were so many other charges. He perjured himself many times. We deposed him once, Deputy Peterson, and he showed up with a Bible in his hand, thinking that was going to save him because we have a civil case against him. But he believed his own lie, Laws, which was terrible. He started believing that it was a sniper on the roof. So I wasn't buying it, but I guess the jury did. So many times on the radio that I've listened to it, he gets on the radio and he says shots fired inside the 1200 building. The 1200 building is where my daughter was murdered. He was driven, we deposed the monitor. There was a retired military guy who drove the Deputy Peterson to the building. All right. He dropped him off. He knew the shooter was inside. He was on the first floor at that time when he drove him to the building. The deputy walked within 9 feet of the building. He was going to reach for the door, and then the rounds went off. And that veteran that dropped him off at that building, he said to me, Andy, I looked in his eyes when I dropped him at those steps, and I said I knew he wasn't going to go in. And then he retreated. He heard all the shots. Then he retreated to where he stood behind the building for 43 minutes. He gets on the radio and he's worried about traffic, Lars, that to stop traffic down the street when there's rounds going off. And he could have went in on the first floor. My daughter, she was murdered, shot 9 times. She was on the 3rd floor. So he could have saved a lot of people that day, and we'll never know because he failed us.
And the one piece of evidence that I knew about, obviously I wasn't sitting in there hearing what the jury heard, but it was something like 93 seconds that went by between the time he unholstered his gun standing outside the building and when the first shots were heard in the building. So he had a minute and a half to maybe get this guy, I won't say his name, but the man who murdered all these people, including your daughter. He could have gone in and confronted the man, and even if he just held him down by shooting in his general direction, that alone might have stopped him from going to the 3rd floor. But he really stuck to the story saying, well, the shooter was on the roof of the building. Then what good are you doing standing under a breezeway on the bottom floor of the building?
Exactly. And, when the shooter was on the 1st floor, Laws, he He could have went in the building. The shooter went up to the second floor. He walked the whole second floor. Everyone was on lockdown. No one was killed on the second floor. Everyone was in lockdown. Not one person on that second floor. And he could have had a clear shot at him. But he retreated. And he told other deputies to stand down. 6 other Broward deputies didn't go in either. He's not the only coward. They all lost their jobs. And one thing that people don't know is that this deputy is getting now a $110,000 pension a year for letting those children get killed. That's what, if he would have got stuck, if he would have got a felony charge in this last trial, he stood a good chance of losing his pension.
Well, when I first brought this up, Andy, when the decision had come down, I got a call from somebody who said, well, do you consider him responsible? I said, yeah, he was acting in loco parentis. And it sounds like what it came down to was, is this person actually a caretaker? Well, I would assume the teacher who's, the student sitting in a classroom with that teacher, the teacher is a caretaker. The principal is easily a caretaker for anything inside that school. But I would even assume that if there's a janitor in the building, that even though he's not a teacher, he doesn't necessarily interact with the kids every day, that you would still say he has a caretaker role for these children. And yet the jury bought the defense argument that if you're a cop assigned to the school to be the school resource officer, that you don't have a formal caretaker responsibility. You're just supposed to be there.
Yep. And one good thing, though, is that this happened in Florida. Well, it was bad for me, but we had another bad trial with the murderer, if you remember, Lars, and he didn't get the death penalty. And it's unbelievable what he did that day, and he didn't get the death penalty. So who could get the death penalty? We thought. So we went after that trial, and we went up to Tallahassee. I met and spoke with the governor, and we changed that law from that trial, my daughter getting murdered. It was unanimous. They had to have a unanimous decision on the death penalty, and we've changed that since to majority. So I think now after this trial, that knowing Florida and knowing my good friends that work in the legislature, the senators, the House reps, the governor, they're going to want to fix this so something like this doesn't happen again.
I'm talking to Andy.
We hold people accountable.
Sorry, Andy. I'm talking to Andy Pollack. His book is called Why Meadow Died, and we've talked about his 18-year-old daughter who was murdered that day back in 2018, 5 years ago. There are some things you've been working on to try to make kids safer in school, because you didn't just sit down and curl up in a fetal position, which I would imagine a lot of parents might have. But, Andy, you said, I'm going to make sure that I change it for somebody else's children. Can you tell my audience how they can learn more about what you're doing?
Sure. A lot of it is in my book, Lars, about the public school system and the different policies, these lenient policies that are in the public schools. And I really enjoy knowing that when parents read my book, they get educated and they learn what to look for, and they learn to get involved locally. It's so important to get involved at a local level if you're a parent, if you have children in the school, because it's more important who's in your school board than who's in the White House when you have children in the schools. I also teamed up with a company called Byrna, Byrna. They do a lot of less lethal products. They have ballistic backpacks. So, I'm constantly working to educate parents, educate teachers. I work with law enforcement, and it just gives me satisfaction knowing that I've helped children. I can't tell you how many emails I get of parents thanking me, that they got involved. A good group for parents to get involved with, they're always asking me, is Moms for Liberty. It's a very good conservative group, and they really go after school board races.
That's the way to do it. Moms for Liberty. Andy, thank you very much. Back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Here's a question for you. Joe Biden wants to run for re-election very clearly. Now, I don't know if he's doing that just to avoid getting prosecuted, because it seems kind of likely that once he's not president anymore, once he doesn't have that political protection that he has built in, then a future DOJ would probably not have to try very hard, assuming the statute of limitations has not been eclipsed, to go after Joe Biden for some of the crimes that connect back to Hunter Biden's various crimes. But his run for re-election is bizarre. He's got now, as of today, the least popular vice president in all of American history. Every single poll that's been done of vice presidents, Kamala Harris ranks at the absolute rock bottom. And then you've got Joe who says, I know, I'm going to run for re-election based on Bidenomics. This is in a country where the average American has lost $10,000 in spending power since Joe took office. You've got real wages, that's wages against inflation, that have fallen every single month since Joe took office. Gasoline prices are up more than $1 from when Joe Biden took office, and for no good reason. And Americans, most of them, their outlook on retirement has hit an 11-year low, with 1 in 4 Americans cutting back on their retirement savings just to pay the bills. So you've got all of that adding up, and he's going to run for re-election based on that. Let's talk to Kurt Couchman, who's Senior Fellow in Fiscal Policy at Americans for Prosperity. Kurt, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Lars. It's great to be back with you.
I'm glad to have you. Is Joe going to have any luck trying to tell Americans, hey, things are great, when the average American who is not living in the White House and is not flying around in Air Force One knows they're not great?
Yeah, things are not great, and it is pretty remarkable that they're trying to gaslight everyone into believing that things are better than they are. I mean, that's fundamentally what they're doing, and they don't have a whole lot to run on. They've been giving special interests tax breaks and subsidies left, right, and center, but that's not good for most people. That's good for the people who get it, but that's a relatively small fraction of the country. And so most people, the people that have to be reached if you want to win a political election, are hurting right now with the inflation and the slower economic growth and the fewer job opportunities, not to mention the high cost of housing, healthcare, education, and the list goes on.
So where does he go from there? And how does this work out? Because I know he's going to try. He's going to give his level best, just like he did in college. You remember when he graduated at the top of his class? He didn't, by the way, that he's going to go around saying, hey, things are great. Sorry about your paycheck. Yes, inflation has eaten more than you have gotten raises in the last 2 years, but hey, vote for me again. Is that going to go anywhere?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to. So, the thing is, it would resonate if it were true, but it doesn't resonate because it's not true. So I think this administration is going to try it, maybe for a couple of weeks, maybe for a couple months. They'll look at the polling they do on it, they'll do their focus groups, and then they're going to find out that it's not resonating with people. I mean, not shocking to you and me. And then they're going to move on to whatever the next thing is, whether it's, bashing Russia again or going after, pharmaceutical companies or energy companies. Like, they'll find some scapegoat to pivot to next, but they're just going to find out this isn't working and they're going to have to try something else. They're just trying to see what'll stick.
Well, and having had the Supreme Court hand them their hat last week and say, no, you can't give away $400 billion in student loan payoffs, except they, I think within hours, promised, well, we'll find another way to get it done. And I guess the other way is even more legally problematic than the first way. But maybe they figure they can kick the can down the road for a while and say, well, it's coming. It's your student loan payoff is coming. Just be patient. Vote for me. It'll come in my second term. I also don't think that's going to be likely to work. Americans aren't that dumb.
Right. I mean, the thing about the Obama and the Biden administrations is they might have actually done a whole lot for freedom and prosperity by overreaching and getting slapped down repeatedly by the Supreme Court. So inch by inch, the Supreme Court is having to actually reassert the rule of law in the face of administrations that are essentially lawless, that are trying to hand out political favors to their supporters, while taking it out of the hide of people they don't perceive as their supporters. So will they be able to forgive student loans more than they have? No. The Congress just passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act that set a hard deadline for them to be able to let people keep pushing back their student loan payments. And the Supreme Court just said, no, you can't do that. And if the Biden administration tries a different route to do the same thing, the Supreme Court is much more likely now to issue an immediate injunction and then knock them down on that too.
I'm talking to Kurt Couchman, who's a senior fellow with in fiscal policy, that's money policy, at Americans for Prosperity. So here's my question that I think is important. We got to hold our side responsible as well. Should I guess that the Republicans will not do a very good job at marketing any of this golden opportunity they've got to put Biden in his place and say, look, you haven't done anything. All you've done is hurt Americans. But are the Republicans going to be able to get that message out?
Well, I think Republicans are being pulled in a lot of different directions right now, and I don't think they're going to focus as much on this, bread and butter kitchen table set of issues as they should. But, Americans for Prosperity is certainly out there talking about these issues and making sure that people all throughout the country hear what the true story is, why they're hurting, and what they can do about it. Now, Congress is potentially moving towards revisiting the whole system. So we've got systemic problems in this country. We've also got, bad and good, more or less, actors, but the systems don't work very well. So Congress is taking a look to see how can we do things better from an institutional perspective. So if that bears any fruit, then we might start to be able to turn this stuff around, get more jobs and opportunity and growth, while also controlling the deficit, reducing the excessive spending that created this inflation that we've been suffering under.
Well, so what can we do about it? I mean, as individuals, because I mean, to me, telling Americans you got to cut your entire lifestyle back. Put less money away for retirement. Don't fund your kids' college. Move to a less expensive place. Turn the lights out and turn the heat up in the summertime and the heat down in the wintertime. Just doesn't seem like a great answer to say this is the way to prosperity. Is stop buying the things your family needs, whether it's energy or food or anything else.
Right. That is not going to be a compelling message. That reminds me of Jimmy Carter, put on a sweater.
No,
wasn't very popular.
I still remember that. Jeez.
So I wasn't in existence at that time, but I've seen the clips and it's pretty funny. What we need to do is unleash supply. There's all sorts of energy investments that could be taking place right now. We burned 40% of the nation's corn production as ethanol in vehicles, where it's actually not very good for vehicles or for miles per gallon or any of that stuff. That's land that could be used to produce other food. The sugar program steers subsidies to a handful of sugar producers, and it comes at the cost of the rest of us. So energy, food, housing is something that a lot of states could actually do on their own, or even local governments. The reason why housing is so expensive at so many places is because they make it really difficult to build the kind of housing that people need and want.
Yep.
So the prices go up because there's a limited supply.
Absolutely right. That's Kurt Couchman, who's a senior fellow at Americans for Prosperity. Kurt, it's a pleasure to have you on. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.